Hello and welcome to American Friction, the only US politics podcast you should be listening to, and we'll find out if you're cheating on us. I'm Jacob Jarvis, and of course today I'm joined by Nikki McCann Ramirez. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Jacob Jarvis.
And today we are joined by a very special guest who I could also describe as the only columnist you should be reading. Jamelle Bouie is a New York Times writer and seems like one of the few people in the media landscape who gets what's going on and is prepared to say what's going on, how it's going on. Jamelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Jamelle, I don't want to make you kind of dish out too many punches to other journalists throughout this, but there does seem to me to be a bit of a question over whether a lot of the news media is meeting the moment. Why do you think that some outlets are perhaps pulling their punches? And does anything ever make you pause and consider pulling yours?
So I'll answer the second question first. Nothing ever makes me pause and consider pulling a punch. That's because I think for someone in my position who I'm a columnist, I don't necessarily have to conform to sort of like the standards of news writing. I have to conform to the standards of journalism, but not sort of the language of news writing. And I'm known to be writing with a perspective. There's sort of like no reason for me to pull my punches. That to me would be doing a disservice to my readers to pull my punches in any way. When it comes to sort of traditional news writing and news gathering, I think sort of two things are happening here. I think first is that the conventions of American news journalism emerged in the context of like a generally broadly lowercase d democratic society. Of course, at the time, and this would have been like the 1930s and 40s, there's segregation in the South. There's like lots of things very not democratic about the United States. But the notion of a free press, of free and fair elections, of elected officials who will relinquish power, who aren't trying to use the power of the state necessarily to punish their political opponents. All these things are kind of taken for granted. And the conventions of news writing like conform to sort of like a baseline level of democratic society. And so in some senses, it shouldn't come as a big surprise to learn that, or to see rather, that those conventions are not up to the task when it comes to coverage of a decidedly anti-democratic movement and attempt to sort of render American democracy much weaker, even a moot point. And yeah, it doesn't surprise me that the conventions of news writing just really aren't equipped for that. So, for example, the president or then the candidate says in the election, I plan to be a dictator for a day. And it's reported on as just sort of like, oh, a thing that he said, and not really treated as either like a serious statement of intent or something to seriously investigate. It's sort of brushed off. That's the first thing. The second thing, maybe there's three things here because I'm thinking of a third thing here.
There can be as many as we need.
The second thing in my my original statement is I think, okay, I don't know if listeners or if y'all watched, we're recording this on Tuesday, May the 6th. Over the weekend, there were these two big interviews with Trump from the Oval Office, basically one with ABC News and then one with NBC's Meet the Press. Terry Moran was the ABC interviewer. Kristen Welker was the NBC interviewer. And they were perfectly adequate interviewers, but I have no real beef with them as interviewers. But an interesting thing happened in both of them, which is that they asked a question and then the president responded with an insane claim, right? Like a bonkers bananas claim. A claim so crazy that if I were in that position, well, okay, I guess the interview is about this now, right? Like you just have to, it's about this. So in the Moran interview, it's
the knuckles.
The tattoos, the alleged association of Kilmar Abrego Garcia to MS-13. And the president says, well, the knuckles say MS-13. And Moran's like, no, that's Photoshop. I mean, actually, it's Microsoft Paint. But that's not real. That's something that was added on after the fact. It's not on the guy's knuckles. And Trump was like, no, it's on his knuckles. And so in that moment, I was watching them like let's make the interview about this. The president's delusional. Let's hey, someone bring this picture here. We're going to really unpack this. But instead, Moran says, let's move on to the next thing. Let's move on to the next thing. And Welker does something similar when Trump is like, I don't know if I have to uphold the Constitution. She's like, oh, okay, that's crazy. Let's move on to the next thing. When really that's the story. That's the interview.
Yeah.
And I think that was what's happening in both of those cases. And I think you can generalize this is that imagine you're the kind of person who has this ambition to interview the president from the Oval Office. And in your mind, it's like, I'm going to interview this newsmaker. I'm going to show the world, I'm going to inform the world about this guy's policies, about what he wants to do. I'm going to perform this great task of information giving. And then you get there and the president is a blathering moron. And it's like, it's like, you can either accept that you're not doing the thing that you thought you'd be doing. You're doing something very different that may cut against your instincts, but you have to do that now. Or you kind of just pretend that you are doing the thing that you're doing. And you say, well, I guess I just have to roll with this. And I think that that's broadly happening, right? That sort of like all these journalists who are in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, they came up, covering at the oldest, Reagan and H.W. Bush, Clinton, Obama, right? And it's like, say, these are all normal politicians, some of them quite respectable men. And you thought you were going to be covering respectable men, and now you're not. And so what do you do about that? And the third thing is, I don't know, I still don't think people take Trump seriously. That's all that is. I think people are like, yeah, he just says things. And it's like, I don't know if you can just like, wave off he just says things about the guy with the nuclear codes. But that's just me.
I want to drill down a little bit more on what you talked about, this idea that a lot of the media operates off of conventions, things we assume to be true. I know as a journalist who skipped Bush and Obama and came in like right in the middle of the first Trump administration, it's been interesting to see a lot of my older colleagues negotiate those conventions. But I think it's even more interesting to watch sort of the political class of DC have every truism they held to be true about their elected officials and how the presidency operated just kind of be thrown out the window in a lot of ways. But I think you have a really interesting political theory when it comes to Trump about how some of those conventions still hold, that Trump is still subject to a lot of the political forces that people, because of the way just the last 8 years have gone, the fact that, he won again this last election cycle, that after January 6th, he wasn't completely exiled from Republican politics, that he is still subject to a lot of political forces, even if it seems like his base is sort of keeping the steam alive in his political career. And I'd love to hear a little more about that because I watch your TikToks and I'm like, yes, this is very true. Tell me more.
So I think you have to separate Trump into, there's like two Trumps. Mm-hmm. There is Trump, the lifelong celebrity, major American cultural figure whose cultural influence like stretches all the way back to the 80s, who has for decades been synonymous with the kind of glitzy, chintzy American new wealth. The apotheosis of this is The Apprentice. Mm-hmm. And then there's Trump, the leader of the Republican Party and president and politician. And I think one of the analytical mistakes a lot of people in the business make is they can't distinguish when one of these things is operative or not. So when Trump is running for something, he's operating in the mode of cultural figure. And so trying to disqualify him on the basis of policies, of attitudes, of these sort of things that would disqualify any other politician, which it's interesting. Those things still do disqualify other politicians, right? Like other regular, normal politicians. We got a great example of this with Ron DeSantis, right? Like just him being weird and awkward on camera was
Mr.
like
Pudding Cups.
Yeah. Pudding cups, white high heel boots, you know Ron DeSantis. Him just being a weird guy, like knocked him out completely. It's like, yeah, that still holds. Like being a weird guy, saying offensive things, like these things for a normal politician still completely hold. But they don't for Trump because people aren't evaluating him when he's in this campaigning mode on that basis. What they're evaluating him on is basically on how he makes them feel and how they connect to his larger cultural image. And they say to themselves, Trump is wealthy and he's successful. And I want that kind of wealth and success, almost like a totem. I want that to be attached to the United States, to the government. And I want there to be a property of transference that happens so that the government gets some of that. If you don't contest that, and you try to just say that Trump is a bad guy, an evil guy, is a destructive guy, is bad at being president or whatever, I don't think it's going to work. But when he is actually in office and he is actually operating in a more formal role, all of a sudden that stuff does work. And so when he does things as president that are unpopular and that are incongruous with his cultural image, people are like, basically, what the fuck? And they get mad. And that's what happened all throughout his first term. And that's what's happening right now. And so the key, I think the one of the things you have to, some of the work you have to do in trying to analyze Trump is figure out, okay, in what mode are people perceiving him, and what mode is he operating? And then the other thing for elections, I mean, this is now too late, but in the terms of elections, you can't contest Trump, the political figure. You kind of have to contest Trump, the cultural figure. You have to sort of discredit Trump, the cultural figure, in order to make inroads against him in an election. So that's my take. And so right now, like the reason why right now, all for as transgressive and everything Trump is, he's still, I think, affected by political gravity, by the winds of the political weather, is that people perceive him to be a political figure. They see that he's literally the president. And so he can't affect the kind of separation he often likes to do between him and whatever role he's occupying. And there are material consequences to the things he does. So when he's just campaigning, there's no material consequences to him saying we're going to tariff everything. And then once he's actually president and Congress has abdicated its power to set tariffs and Trump is tariffing everything, and the store shelves are empty, then it's like, okay, fuck Trump, right? Now, all of us would say, okay, but this is predictable. You should have been able to predict this last year. You should have been able to see,
he said he was going to do this.
Right. There's a straight line to draw here from A to B. But I think actually drawing that line for people takes a lot of political and cultural work that I'm actually not sure was possible given the overall political and cultural environment of 2024.
You spoke about how Trump makes people feel, and he does seem to me that, particularly with his supporters, he's really good at harnessing their feelings and parroting those back to them. And one thing I sort of noticed with the way he talks to people is that it's easier to be angry than to feel hopeless or helpless. People don't like to feel vulnerable in that sort of way. They'd rather feel angry about their situation than feel just, despondent around it. Is that a sort of feeling that maybe the Democrats need to get better at harnessing that anger in a way that Trump has clearly been able to in the past? And as you say, people are thinking, what the fuck now? And fuck this guy seems to be a feeling that is there and ripe to be taken by the Democrats, but they're not quite getting it at the moment. And how do you think that they maybe could do that in a more powerful way?
So I think you're right. And I think that there is a real opportunity. The way I've been putting it is an opportunity to perform anger. People are angry, and they're looking for political leaders to perform that anger, to reflect it back at them. And part of the job of the political leaders, of course, is to do this in a constructive way, to both sort of acknowledge the anger, kind of perform it back, but not let it be nihilistic, right? Let it be a constructive kind of anger that can be channeled towards something useful. I think I agree that Democrats have a real hard problem with that. I think that problem is downstream of generational differences. Many of the top Democratic leadership are quite old, and not like just in their 60s, but in their 70s and 80s. It's funny. I'm reading this book, Collapse: The Fall of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And it goes through the period in late Soviet history where it's gerontocracy, or, you have all these leaders who, are dying after Brezhnev. They're just dying one after another. And it's like, man, the Soviet leadership is so old. And it's like, these were like 68-year-old men, right? Like today, if Biden were 68, you'd be like, yeah, that dude's a spring chicken, right?
Yeah.
By contrast, it's sort of like, yeah, James Clyburn, rather, from South Carolina, he's like 82. Nancy Pelosi is like 80, I think 81. Biden's 81, right? Even Trump is 78. All these people are like, septo and octogenarians. And they just are acculturated in a different kind of political world where, the job of an elected official was to be this sort of like staid representative of the status quo, to be responsible. And I think Democrats in particular are obsessed with being responsible. You saw this during the shutdown fight earlier in the year, that the Chuck Schumer's primary argument for not just letting Republicans shut the government down is that Democrats have to be responsible. And I think that's just the wrong, it sounds crazy. This is the wrong orientation to have towards being in the political opposition. In fact, being in the political opposition frees you of responsibility. And although there's some danger to that, you can't get high off of that. I think part of what happened to Republicans is they basically sort of like, they violated one of the 10 crack commandments. They got too high off their own supply and began to always see themselves as being in a position of opposition but no responsibility. You can't go that far. But within limits, you can acknowledge that now that you're in the opposition, and especially when the other side has complete control of the government, listen, the American people elected you to do it, so go ahead and do it. And you have no responsibility to rescue them from their own mistakes. But the other part of that is that if you're no longer tasked with being responsible, of showing your responsibility, then what are you tasked with? And I would say you're tasked with performing, reflecting back onto the feelings, the frustrations, the anger of the people that you represent, and channeling that in a constructive way into the business of government, into the business of politics. What will it take for Democrats to be able to do that? I don't know. Part of me thinks it's just going to be like individual Democrats like picking up on the opportunity and like running with it and sort of establishing themselves and kind of forcibly taking leadership, even if it's not formal leadership, if it's simply informal leadership from formal leaders. Because I'm not sure there's anything you could do to get the formal leadership class of the Democratic Party to do this. And I'll say, this isn't ideological, right? Like you don't have to be a lefty to do this. You can be like the most sensible centrist in the world and still perform anger over attacks on the rule of law, on attacks on diversity, right? You can still do all of that. So it's why I really think it's an attitudinal thing happening. It's not ideological at all. It's like very much how Democratic lawmakers conceptualize themselves as political actors. And they don't conceptualize themselves as actors. They conceptualize themselves as sort of like responsible officials. But I'm a big reader of 19th century American history. Like the thing about politics in the 19th century was that it was rowdy, that people, even the most respectable politicians, understood that part of what their job was performing the emotions of the people who supported them. Someone like William Seward, who is the most respectable, staid, he's an abolitionist, but he's a very calm guy of the antebellum period. Nonetheless, will give fiery speeches, being like there's an irrepressible conflict. I'm doing a Bernie Sanders thing. William Seward wasn't a Bernie Sanders type, but this, there's an irrepressible conflict with the slave power, and kind of what was considered to be rhetoric so extreme that it may have damaged his political prospects. But he understood that that's part of what the job was. And today, part of what the job is just to let your constituents know, in the words of Bill Clinton, that you feel their pain, that you feel their anger.
I want to circle back a little bit about this notion of like who's responsible for the decision making, just in the sense that the people who theoretically are responsible for this decision making right now, the Republican Party, the Republican leadership, are in like conspiracy of dunce territory. You've had some really interesting takes, and I think I agree with them, and we've discussed it a bit on the podcast, about how Trump may not necessarily be the actual decision maker within the American government right now. I we discussed it a lot around the time of the election and when he was forming his cabinet. This idea, in my view, he's not a policy guy. He never has been. I frankly believe he hates the actual requirements of governing. And that one of the scariest thing about this second term is that the people around Trump weren't going to be the like, quote unquote, sensible Republicans who would pump the brakes when they needed to, because I think a lot of the people in the first administration were still ideologues who allowed a lot of bad shit to happen. But that this time around, they were going to be true believers who were willing and just chomping at the bit to do the work that Trump himself doesn't really feel like doing. I think what you said in response to the first question about Trump operating as a celebrity versus a politician, I think he enjoys the celebrity moments. To him, the actual political moments and political burden is just that. It's a burden. And I'd love to hear more about your theory on who's actually running things right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right in terms of Trump's relationship to it. I've always thought it was interesting that during the first campaign in 2016, allegedly, this is all alleged. I mean, it's all sourced and supported, but like the campaigns denied it at the time. But allegedly, Trump's son, Trump Jr., approached John Kasich's people, and Kasich was sort of one of the leading contenders to be vice president, and said to Kasich, listen, if you join up with us, you can basically be the president. You can do all the work. And, my dad he'll just be making America great again. He'll basically be like the mascot. And you can really be the actual person with the power. And Kasich was like, no, I don't want to do that. But I think that's totally true. I think that story, in part because it completely fits with who Trump is. It rings very true.
I can't believe they were shopping out like the Dick Cheney model party. That's kind of insane.
Because I mean, the thing is, and this is probably worth saying, what is the job of being president? The job of being president isn't actually just giving speeches. It isn't, as Trump conceptualized, being a mascot.
Yeah.
It's not even really, in the words of George W. Bush, it's not even really being the decider. I think that the guy who had the best gloss on what the job was Eisenhower. And Eisenhower conceptualized the job as basically triage. It's triage of every crisis that is coming towards the country, towards the government. He had this basically decision matrix, like a 4-quadrant box. And the first quadrant, the top left, is like, this is very important and this is urgent. And for Eisenhower, these are the things that I had to handle. I personally have to take charge of this.
I know exactly what you're talking about because my dad uses this exact matrix.
These are the things that are not urgent, but still very important. Then you have the things that are urgent and not all that important. Then you have the things that are not urgent, not important. And for Eisenhower, the job of being president was basically putting the things in the boxes. You put the thing in the box and then you tell someone to do the thing that's in that box. And the challenge is that maybe you put something in not urgent, not important, and then events happen and all of a sudden it moves up to urgent and important, and you have to handle it. Like, you can't predict how things will fall and how things will move, and you're making judgment calls. And everything flows downstream from that being your job. And that's fundamentally something Trump is not actually equipped to do. He can't do it. He never has been able to. And so he's kind of outsourcing all of this to everyone else around him. And in practice, what I think that means is that you have kind of a handful of people who are close to Trump, who they have their own sense of what's urgent and what's important. And then they're saying to Trump, this is urgent and important, and we got to do it now. And that's Stephen Miller, that's Russell Vought, that's what's his name, Peter Navarro, that's Lutnick, I forget his first name.
Howard
Lutnick, yeah. Whoever is in that inner circle, they're effectively, I think what they're basically doing is going into the Oval Office saying to Trump, we got to do this now. It's really important. Here's an executive order that would make it happen. And then he does it. The problem is that there's no one really minding everything else. No one really paying attention to the things that, okay, they seem unimportant now, but they might be important later. No one really even managing the stuff that is like not urgent, but still kind of critical to take care of. Things that you would sort of give to a competent cabinet secretary and their deputies to handle. And it's still early in this administration, so we're not really seeing the impact of that. But like we're getting to the point where, we're going to see what happens when there's no one actually engaging in proper triage of what's coming towards the government, towards the country, towards whomever.
Did you see the Reuters report about Hegseth this morning?
I did not.
Oh, yeah. So apparently, like a week into this administration, they have a meeting in the Oval Office where they're like discussing Ukraine. No orders are given, but like cutting military aid to Ukraine is discussed. Hegseth walks out of that meeting and orders all shipments of military arms to Ukraine to be stopped.
What the fuck?
Yeah. We just wrote it up. It's from Reuters. We wrote it up for Rolling Stone. But Ukrainian and Polish officials start calling the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, being like, hey, what the fuck's going on here? Like, are you guys cutting us off? Is this what's happening? And no one outside of like Hegseth's immediate team knew that this had happened. And it just kind of got hushed up. They restarted the shipments, but it came out this morning that Hegseth just walked out of a meeting and was like, okay, president is thinking about cutting off the arms. Let's just cut off the arms.
That's so crazy.
Insane.
That is such... I've been struggling with what I'm going to write about this week. I have no idea. Mm-hmm. And that's actually like an interesting thing to write about because it's not just an example of Hegseth being a dumbass, which I always love those examples of. That guy, let me just, as an aside, that guy radiates stupidity. Like there aren't very many people in the world that you look at them and you're like, I don't think that guy's bright. And Pete Hegseth is one of them. You look at him and you're like, I don't know if he could like find his way out of a room.
This is true.
Anyway, the thing that's interesting about that in terms of presidential management is that if the job is triage, then the most important thing you do as president is just like personnel, who you're picking to lead things. And you want to, there's a balance you have to hit. You have to pick people who have enough competence and initiative and good judgment to be able to anticipate both the challenges that are going to come that way and know the kinds of things that you're not going to want to kick up to the president or really to the chief of staff. You got to be able to just handle your own domain as much as possible. And the president has to be comfortable giving the person that much free rein to do that. But at the same token, you can't have someone who is so independent that they're basically making policy themselves. They have to actually be in communication with the White House, which in turn means that the White House has to be in communication with these people, has to be checking in, has to be making sure that things are running smoothly. And the fact that Hegseth would just go ahead and unilaterally make a major policy change without any real consultation with anyone else is both a sign that he's maybe not too independent, but too sycophantic. Like wants Trump's approval so badly that he'll just do what he thinks Trump wants. But then the White House isn't obviously in very much communication. There clearly is a communication problem happening here because you shouldn't leave a meeting like that and think to yourself, well, the thing I should do is, even if I want to impress the president, the thing I should do is unilaterally make a major American foreign policy change. Like that's wild.
No, I think you hit it though. It's you want people who have like initiative, good judgment. I think the people Trump has around him have a ton of initiative, an excess of initiative, and they lack everything else. And I think if we go back to, I think it was the ABC interview where when they were discussing the knuckle tattoos, Guillermo Abrego Garcia, and Trump was being pressed about, defying the Supreme Court, they had this order to get him back. Trump's response to that was, well, I leave that up to my lawyers, which the way the Department of Justice is currently talking about themselves, that's him referring to the Department of Justice. I think it also is a built-in way for Trump to excuse himself of any sort of accountability. It's, I'm leaving it up to my cabinet officials and they're all doing a really great job.
Which in reality, when it gets to a point where the Supreme Court is actively swatting down a thing the president is doing, typically presidents take, they take, that's an urgent and important thing for a president to kind of take charge of. And Trump constantly deferring to the Department of Justice. I think you're right to say that it's him trying to avoid accountability. Like everything he does. I mean, this to me is why it's so bizarre, the cult of personality around him and the cult of him being some sort of like, I think JD Vance called him a man of action, which as a parenthetical, it's like,
I've seen that man get in and out of a golf cart. Like, no.
Yeah, first of all, no, yeah. Second of all, just who other than like weird fascists on the internet refer to anyone as like a man of action? It's like Vance will say these things occasionally where it's like, oh yeah, he spends all of his time reading like, 17-year-old Nazis on Twitter, right? Like that's what he does with his free time. Anyway, Trump is not some man of action. He constantly evades responsibility. And that's what this is. He has a good enough sense for politics that he knows that he's in a politically perilous place. And so he's like, no, it's the lawyers doing it. It's not me. As if it's not his job to like make the final decision. And I mean, this is where, this is going to lead to disaster for everyone. He just refuses to actually make the final decision. He's always looking for some way to be able to say that it's not his fault. And so when, for example, when this summer, most likely we start seeing empty shelves because, there's just no shipping coming to the United States from China, Trump will be giving an interview where he's going to say, well, it wasn't my idea. It was
Peter Navarro.
Yeah, it was Peter Navarro. They told me that this is how it was going to work. So you can't blame me. And it actually, I mean, that kind of evasion of responsibility makes it kind of impossible to hold the government accountable. It makes everything. It makes sort of like it itself makes government not work. If you have no one at the top who's willing to take responsibility. I just add a little hobby horse of mine. It is interesting to me that Trump has become this sort of like load bearing figure for the unitary executive theory of executive power. This notion that the president is like this singular, almost like elected monarch type figure. And part of the justification for investing the president with this much authority over the entire executive branch is that it improves democratic accountability. And so it's funny that unitary executive theorists are sort of like all in on Trump for the most part. And here's a guy who's like refuses to take responsibility for anything.
It's an issue that's going to come here as well, Jamelle, and this kind of ties back a little bit to, I think, earlier in our conversation when we were talking about how the media reports on Trump and then looking at things like the Eisenhower matrix and that sort of thing, is that you would usually expect that, say, whatever goes into that matrix, when it does get done, it gets done and then it's kind of off. It's then off the matrix. Is the issue that's happening with Trump and that's making him particularly hard to discuss and in some ways really boring to discuss in certain circumstances is that it just keeps looping back.
Yeah.
And, I feel like we could have this conversation again in, say, a year's time, and these issues are all just going to have piled on top of each other. And if that's something that we need to kind of get our heads around, and which is different to following politics in the past where problems seem to happen in a line, and now they're happening in a pile. And that pile's just going to keep getting jumbled over the next 4 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. They're not, because they're monomaniacally focused on their own, whatever they perceive as being most urgent. They're letting all these other challenges pile up, problems pile up. They're ignoring them. And, we'll see the effects of that soon. But even the things that they are interested in trying to do, they aren't competent enough, aren't patient enough to see them through. And so that also adds to the burden of things they have to take care of. I think, I hate the policy, but I think the deportation stuff is actually a great example of this. They clearly really want to do the deportations. They want to remove as many people as possible. But to me, at least, it seems as if they themselves are aware that, first of all, there's actually not enough people to deport through like immediate means that would hit the numbers that they were giving to the public, that they're actually not organized enough to really launch a project of like genuine mass deportation, which is why now they're like, you get $1,000 in self-deport. And there are all these problems that emerge from what they're doing. You're shipping people off to a foreign gulag, and now you're just tied up in court. You're just tying up a bunch of your Justice Department. You're unlawfully detaining people, so now you're tied up in court on that. They clearly did not game out in advance the kinds of obstacles they would run into, even doing a modified version of what they want to do. And so now they have all these problems piling up from this attempt to make this policy work that is also distracting from, everything else. And it doesn't help that they've slashed so much from the federal bureaucracy that as load-bearing things start to break, they're going to have to be diverting resources in order to take care of it. And, there's got to be a disaster of some sort. Like it's only a matter of time.
There's a reason in films why the evil geniuses are geniuses and not idiots. And that's kind of, we're seeing that play out. Like evil idiots doesn't work as a storyline. And unfortunately, that seems to be what's going on over in America at the moment. Yeah, Jamelle, the final question I'd like to ask you is that, I mean, it's a more of an existential question, I suppose, than anything super tangible. But from afar, talking about all this, it can make me feel pretty down. And I think that a lot of listeners and a lot of people out there want to be looking at ways to not feel like that and to feel a bit more purposeful with this information. What kind of does give you hope at the moment? What makes you cling on to hope that this isn't going to be forever?
So one thing is, first, that Trump is old, and people do die. Mortality is a thing.
Although I looked up that I think the average age expectancy for billionaires is 83 or something. So he will live a little bit longer than, your average Joe.
Well, still, but beyond that, and then just in the political realm of things, the fact that, they're speed running a recession, people don't like that. People don't like to lose their jobs. People don't like inflation, these things. So on a very practical political level, I think that just the fact that Trump's agenda is basically untethered from reality. Reality always reasserts itself. And I think we're going to get some of that. And it'll be painful, but I think it'll kind of maybe grievously harm the administration. But beyond those things, I think that if there's anything that gives me hope, it is that I don't actually think that most Americans want some kind of MAGA autocracy. I don't think that they do. I think that most Americans are actually quite jealous of what they think to be is American democracy. I think they, even if they don't necessarily want to articulate it in these terms, I think they would try to preserve it. And I think that anyone hoping to turn the United States into some sort of competitive authoritarian state faces a tremendous uphill battle, stemming from the fact that the U.S. is a country that, for all of its many faults, does have this deep-rooted free society stretching back hundreds of years. And I think you have to do a little more than, play at being a dictator to really uproot that and unravel that. So that's what gives me hope, I suppose. I don't necessarily think that sort of the political opposition is going to be perfect or anything. This very much is a thing about ordinary Americans and their capacity for challenging those who would try to rob them of their liberties. And I think that if we do get to a point with the current government where they are going completely mask off, I think you'll see many, 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 many millions of Americans respond in a powerful way. So that's where my hope comes from.
Jamelle, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate speaking to you.
Thank you for having me. This was a real pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening to American Friction. Remember, if you want to support the show and help us to keep having conversations with people such as Jamelle, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. You'll get episodes ad-free, bonus content, and a whole lot more. Go to patreon.com/American Friction for the link in the show notes. I'm Jacob Jarvis. Thank you for listening to American Friction.